in October of 2010, Hurricane Richard hit Central America and caused widespread damage in the tiny country of Belize. And one area of Belize that was hit in particular very hard was a nature reserve called Runaway Creek. Now, nobody lives in Runaway Creek, but it does happen to be the primary field site for a group of researchers from the University of Calgary who study spider monkeys. So I arrived at Runaway Creek to learn a little bit more about this project and to work with these researchers about 6 months after the hurricane. And it just so happened that this was at the tail end of a particularly hot, dry season. So the combination of the hot, dry season and all of these trees, thousands of trees that had been felled by the hurricane a few months earlier, basically turned the whole forest into a tinderbox. And as you can see, there were dozens of forest fires that basically started up. And these forest fires caused huge amounts of damage all through Runaway Creek and made life very difficult for the resident species. However, it did in fact present some very interesting research opportunities for the anthropologists working there. And they were able to ask questions that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to ask, and things that they couldn't actually have predicted. Questions like, how do animals fare after a natural disaster? And it got me to thinking, well, how do researchers fare after a natural disaster? What do they do when their entire field site has been destroyed, and how can they take advantage of it when that happens? So after last year's fire in Fort McMurray, I realized that there was another opportunity to kind of explore this idea a little bit more, and of course somewhere a little bit closer to home. So I contacted 2 research groups who have both worked in that area for a long period of time, and to ask them, well, what was their experience? What happened to their field sites, and how have they dealt with it, and how will they continue to deal with it in this field season? So the first group, Owl Moon Environmental, they are a private consulting company owned and operated by Christine Godwin and Ken Foster. And among other things, they monitor bird populations in the boreal forest. The second group is Dana Schock's research group. So she teaches and runs her research program out of Keano College. And she also does a lot of collaborative work with Environment and Climate Change Canada on contaminants in the area. And they basically focus on the health of wetlands in the boreal forest. So in terms of research, we often think of a natural disaster as kind of being a starting point. A huge disaster happens and a whole bunch of people come into the area to sort of look at how the recovery is going to take place, right? It's the beginning of research projects. But for people who have been working in the area for a long period of time, that's quite different. They have this sort of advantage because they have all of this baseline data from before the disaster, and now they can compare that to what has happened after the disaster. So having this sort of pre and post-disaster data, they can really use to their advantage, and it's relatively uncommon to have because it's fairly difficult to predict when or where a disaster might strike. But in fact, this is exactly what these 2 research groups have. So Owl Moon, they monitor bird species in the boreal forest. They look at how different species use different habitats for breeding purposes, and they look at which habitats they prefer, how they use them and which ones they prefer. So they basically use the diversity of the bird species and the size of the bird populations as a proxy for the health of that habitat. They have over 30 different field sites spaced all around Fort McMurray. Some of these field sites are relatively undisturbed sites. Others are maybe a bit fragmented or have some surface disturbance. And others are on reclaimed mining sites, which means they're going to have a lot of surface disturbance and disturbance beneath the surface as well. And they're going to look at the different species of birds they see in all of these different disturbed habitats and compare them to the bird species they see on the undisturbed habitats. And then, of course, last year, the fire came. So they ended up having 2 of their field sites were almost entirely incinerated, really from the ground up. They were really very badly damaged. And the rest of their field sites kind of had a large variation. Some of them lost the undergrowth, but the canopy was still intact. Others were more or less untouched. So this opened up this opportunity for them to kind of look. They now have this habitat reset, they described it to me. So the damaged sites now, especially the ones that were very badly damaged, they can compare those sites to what the reclaimed sites might be. And now it gives them this opportunity to look at how birds are starting to re-enter and recolonize these damaged sites, and compare how do birds recolonize a site that was damaged by a natural disaster to how birds recolonize and use a habitat that was damaged by industrial disturbances. And of course, it's important to remember that boreal forests, they're supposed to burn, right? It's good for them. So there are lots of different burn sites, historic burn sites all around Fort McMurray. So there are burn sites from 2011 and 2003 in the late 90s and the 80s. And each one of these burn sites represents a different time point. So now in 2017, we're sort of 5 years after some of them, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years after some of these burn sites. And they can look at these and they can say, okay, which trees do we have here and which bird species do we have here at 5 years after a burn, 10 years, 20 years after a burn. And they can now, because of the burn last year, they can add a new time point onto this. They now have time point 0, right? And what they're able to do now is build up this whole sort of trajectory of recovery that they expect a habitat to follow. So they know which tree species and which bird species to expect to colonize at each of these different time points. And they can compare this, again, to this trajectory of recovery in a burned region to a reclaimed site. So just to give an example, some of the birds that they might expect, some of the early colonizing birds that they might expect, and they expect to even see them this year in the damaged sites, include the savanna sparrow and the clay-colored sparrow. And as the sites start to regenerate over a few years, they expect to start seeing warblers and then flycatchers move in. But they told me that it could take 2, 3, 4 decades of regrowth before they start seeing flickers and woodpeckers move into the area. From the air, let's move down to the water and talk about Dana Schock's project. So she monitors wetlands, the health and productivity of wetlands. And she uses these wood frogs as her indicator species. The better the health of the wood frog population indicates healthier wetlands. And she studies this in 13 different wetlands that are all surrounding Fort McMurray. And these wetlands are in varying proximities to some of Fort McMurray's industrial activities. And at each wetland, each year, she takes samples of water, and she samples different water parameters to get an idea of the health of the water. So she looks at things like the pH and the conductivity of the water, and then measures a bunch of different contaminants within the water as well, things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And then they take this data, how healthy is the water, and they're going to compare it to how healthy is the wood frog population. So they do this by looking for how many clutches of eggs are there, how healthy do the eggs look. They try to get an estimate of the viability of the eggs. And then they look at the time of hatching of the eggs, how healthy do the tadpoles look. They look at the time of metamorphosis as the tadpoles turn into frogs, and how healthy do the frogs look. And of course, to get an idea of what the adult population of wood frogs is going to be. Again, healthier wood frog population means healthier wetlands. And then, last year, the fire hit. And it wasn't just a normal forest fire, of course, right? It burned not just trees, but it burned buildings, it burned houses, it burned cars, it burned appliances. And of course, this sent all sorts of unusual contaminants into the air, and that got into not just the air, but the ground and the water as well. And so Dana stressed to me how important it was going to be this year to get the best data possible so that she can pick out this fingerprint, this contaminant fingerprint of the fire against this sort of overall backdrop of contaminants, baseline contaminant levels in that region, so that you can say, yes, These contaminants are because of the fire, and they're kind of separate from the background contaminant level to generate this contaminant profile of the whole region. One of the things that both of these research groups told me was that their work in the field, their field season, is really time sensitive. So they both expressed to me that even as they were being evacuated, like actually as they were driving out of town, they were already making plans for how are we going to get back into the field and what are we going to do? Trying to make contingency plans to try to salvage the remainder of their field season. And of course, at that time, they didn't know how long they were going to be away from their homes. And because of a little bit of luck and a lot of careful planning, they were actually able to salvage their field season to some extent, to varying extents. But there's no question that this event has changed how they are training their field crews this year. So Owl Moon in particular, they have field crews who are from all over. And of course, their crews are going to be interacting with and working with people who are from Fort McMurray and their industry partners there. And it's important to remember that some of these people, of course, will have lost their homes and still be dealing with their, more or less successfully, with their insurance. And that the fire, that event last year, is still extremely raw for people. And in order to make sure that they can maintain solid relationships with the people that they're working with, they included some sensitivity training with their out-of-town crew this year. Because their relationships, it's not an easy place to work. So they told me that their work relationships that they have up there are really absolutely crucial to getting good data and to having successful field seasons. And they made it really clear to me that it was those relationships last year, not just during their evacuation, but actually upon re-entry, that were vital to getting their field crews out as quickly as possible, deployed out into the field as quickly and as safely as possible, and that those relationships are so important for successful working up there. And as Dana mentioned to me, their work is so time sensitive that in a way they didn't really have time to mess around with all of those things like insurance. So Dana didn't lose her house, but did have some damage to it. And so one of the things she said to me was, I might be frustrated by my insurance, but my frogs are done breeding in 4 days. So I really don't have time to deal with that, and I'll just have to feel sorry for myself later. So how will the fire affect them this year? Now, that's something they don't really yet know because we haven't had a full annual cycle of a field season yet. But they can predict a few things. So regrowth actually happens really, really quickly. I was there early July last year, and there was already a lot of new growth happening. And they think that this year, even last year, in the sites that had burned really badly, they were already seeing birds and wildlife moving through those areas. They weren't necessarily sticking around, but they were moving through those areas. And this year, a lot of the standing dead trees, they think will probably start to fall once it happened already. And that's actually going to help with the restructuring of the habitat on the ground, which is very useful for a lot of the birds that they're studying because they do nest on the ground. So starting, with that slow kind of restructuring and rebuilding of that habitat, they actually have pretty high hopes that they will in fact see a lot of birds back this year. And as for the wetlands, Dana told me a story that one of her wetlands that happened to be really near town, it's actually almost in town, was absolutely destroyed by fire last year. So she went out to it and there was absolutely nothing left. There was no vegetation. It was completely burned. The water quality was just terrible and there was nothing alive in the pond. So they felt this is pretty clear what we're going to find there this year. And they went out just last week to sort of do their due diligence to test the pond and say, we won't have to work here this year. It'll take a while before bacteria and algae and vegetation all grows back. So they tested the water quality and they found that it was already back to pre-fire levels. And then they found that there were hundreds of clutches of wood frog eggs, and they didn't know where they came from. And these eggs actually looked healthier than some that they had found in some of their ponds that hadn't been touched by fire at all. So they were completely surprised, but also said, maybe this is just wetlands doing what wetlands do best, which is clean things up. So the jury is still out a little as to how the fire will affect them, but they have high hopes that things might look pretty good. We can look at disasters from different perspectives. Disasters can be ends to things, right? I mean, this is obviously losing your house, losing your belongings, trees dying. They can also be beginnings. They can be the start of new research projects. They can be new trees growing. But I think for these researchers who have been working there for a long time, it is really just more like a pivot point or a new time point in them being able to learn this whole trajectory of recovery and be able to piece together a more comprehensive picture of the ecosystem in which they're working. So I just want to end with a quote that I think really sums up the attitude of these researchers very well. And this was when I asked Dana how her and her field team felt on May 3rd, on the anniversary of the evacuation. What did you think? What did you do? How did you feel? And she said to me, on May 3rd, there were memorials all over the place. And I asked my field crew, what do you want to do today? And we all decided we wanted to go out to a pond. So we went out, we spent a perfectly fabulous day out at my favorite pond, and we were doing exactly what we were supposed to be doing, and it was great. Thank you for listening.